The morning fog hung thick around Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell began his routine patrol. He had been a royal guard for 12 years and nothing ever surprised him anymore. The same faces, the same routines, the same quiet corridors filled with centuries of history. But today would be different. James walked through the East Wing, checking each door and window as he always did. The Queen had been away for 3 weeks on official business, and the palace felt eerily quiet without her presence. Even the staff seemed to move more quietly, as if waiting for her return. As he rounded the corner near the service entrance, James noticed something unusual. Queen Camilla's personal car was parked in an odd position. The black sedan sat at a strange angle, as if someone had been in a hurry when parking it. The trunk appeared slightly raised, not completely closed. James frowned. He knew the Queen Consort's schedule by heart, and she wasn't supposed to be at the palace today. Her calendar showed meetings in London until evening. So why was her car here? And why did it look like someone had left in a rush? The guard approached the vehicle carefully. His training kicked in immediately. Any unusual activity around royal property required investigation. He circled the car once, checking for signs of tampering or damage. Everything looked normal except for that slightly open trunk. James reached for his radio to call the security desk, but then he heard footsteps echoing from the nearby corridor. Quick, nervous footsteps that seemed to be moving away from the car. He decided to investigate the trunk first before reporting anything. The morning sun broke through the clouds just as James reached the back of the car. He could see a thin line of light where the trunk hadn't closed properly. Something was definitely wrong. In all his years of service, he had never seen any royal vehicle left in such a careless state. James looked around to make sure he was alone, then carefully lifted the trunk lid. What he saw inside made his heart skip a beat. There were several small velvet bags scattered across the trunk floor, and one had spilled open slightly. Even in the dim light, he could see the unmistakable sparkle of diamonds. His hands trembled as he reached for his radio. This was far beyond anything he had ever encountered during his years of service. The diamonds looked exactly like the ones he had seen during state ceremonies, the ones that belonged to the Crown Jewels collection. James quickly closed the trunk and stepped back. His mind raced with questions. How did these diamonds end up in Queen Camilla's car? Why was the car parked so carelessly? And most importantly, who else knew about this? The guard found a position where he could watch the car while remaining hidden behind a stone pillar. He needed to see who would come back for the vehicle. His radio crackled softly and he turned the volume down. Whatever was happening here, he needed to handle it carefully. Minutes felt like hours as James waited and watched. The palace grounds remained quiet except for the occasional tourist group being led past the gates in the distance. The morning shift change wouldn't happen for another hour, which meant he was alone with this discovery. Then he heard them again. Those same quick footsteps, but this time they were approaching the car. James pressed himself against the pillar and watched as a figure emerged from the shadows of the building. It was someone wearing palace staff clothing, but James couldn't see the face clearly from his position. The person moved directly to the car and tried to open the trunk. When it didn't open immediately, they became visibly agitated, looking around nervously before trying again. James realized this person had a key to the vehicle, which meant they either worked closely with Queen Camilla or had somehow obtained unauthorized access. James made a quick decision. He stepped out from behind the pillar and called out in his most authoritative voice. The figure froze, then slowly turned around. What James saw next shocked him even more than finding the diamonds. The person standing beside Queen Camilla's car was Margaret Whitfield, the Queen Consort's personal secretary. She had worked for the royal family for over 20 years and was known for her absolute loyalty and discretion. Her face was pale with fear, and her usually perfect composure had completely disappeared. "Margaret," James said carefully, keeping his distance but blocking her path to the car. "I need to ask you some questions about this vehicle and what's inside the trunk." Margaret's eyes darted between James and the car. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. For a moment, the only sound was the distant traffic from the London streets beyond the palace walls. "I can explain everything," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "But you have to understand, I never meant for any of this to happen. It was supposed to be simple and no one was supposed to get hurt." James felt his pulse quicken. Margaret's words suggested something much larger than a simple mistake or misunderstanding. The diamonds in the trunk, her nervous behavior, and now her admission that something had gone wrong. It all pointed to a situation that was spinning out of control. "Margaret, I need you to step away from the car," James said firmly, "and then you're going to tell me exactly what's been happening here, starting with why the Queen's diamonds are in Queen Camilla's trunk." The morning that had started so routinely had suddenly become the most important day of James Mitchell's career. As he looked at Margaret's frightened face and thought about the precious stones hidden just a few feet away, he realized that whatever happened next would change everything. Margaret Whitfield's hands shook as she looked at Sergeant Mitchell. 23 years of faithful service to the royal family, and now everything was falling apart in a single morning. She had always prided herself on being the perfect secretary, the one person everyone could trust with the most sensitive information. "James, please," she began, her voice cracking. "You have to understand that I was only trying to protect the Queen. Someone threatened her, and I thought I could handle it myself without involving the security team." James kept his position between Margaret and the car. His training told him to call for backup immediately, but something in Margaret's desperate tone made him want to hear her story first. "What kind of threat, Margaret? And why are the Queen's diamonds in this car?" Margaret glanced around nervously, then took a deep breath. 3 weeks ago, I received a phone call at my office. A man's voice, disguised somehow, told me he knew about the Queen's private collection. He said he had photographs of her personal vault and detailed information about her daily routines. The morning air felt colder as Margaret continued her explanation. James noticed that her usually perfect hair was disheveled, and her clothes looked like she had slept in them. This was not the composed professional woman he had known for years. The caller demanded that I remove specific pieces from the collection. Margaret went on. He said if I didn't cooperate, he would release embarrassing information about the Queen's financial dealings to the newspapers. Information that could damage her reputation forever. James felt his stomach tighten. "So you stole the diamonds?" "I didn't steal them." Margaret's voice rose, then she quickly lowered it again. "I borrowed them. The plan was to meet the blackmailer, give him what he wanted, and then somehow get the diamonds back. I thought I could solve this quietly and protect the Queen from scandal." The guard studied Margaret's face carefully. In his 12 years of service, he had become good at reading people. Margaret appeared to be telling the truth, but there were still too many questions. "How did you get access to the Queen's private collection?" Margaret's cheeks flushed red. "I've been managing the Queen's personal appointments for over 2 decades. She trusts me completely. I have keys to areas that most staff members never see. The private vault is one of them." James realized the gravity of the situation was even worse than he had initially thought. If Margaret was telling the truth, then someone outside the palace had detailed knowledge of the royal family's most private affairs. That suggested either an inside source or sophisticated surveillance. "When were you supposed to meet this person?" James asked. "Today, at noon, in Hyde Park near the Serpentine Lake. He gave me very specific instructions about where to leave the diamonds and how to retrieve them later." Margaret looked at her watch. "That's in 3 hours." The guard felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This was no longer just about stolen diamonds, it was about national security and the safety of the royal family. But he also realized that involving the full security apparatus might make the situation worse, especially if the blackmailer was monitoring palace communications. "Margaret, show me exactly what's in the trunk," James said firmly. With trembling fingers, Margaret opened the trunk fully. James counted 7 small velvet bags, each containing what appeared to be extremely valuable diamonds. Even in the morning light, the stones caught the sun and created small rainbows on the car's interior. "These are from the Queen's private collection." "Not the official crown jewels," Margaret explained. "They were gifts from various world leaders over the years. The blackmailer somehow knew exactly which pieces to ask for." James picked up one of the bags and examined its contents. The diamonds were indeed magnificent, probably worth millions of pounds. But what concerned him more was how the blackmailer had such specific knowledge of the Queen's personal possessions. "Have you told anyone else about this?" James asked. Margaret shook her head vigorously. "No one." The caller made it very clear that involving security or the police would result in immediate publication of the compromising information. "I've been handling this alone for 3 weeks, trying to find a solution that wouldn't hurt the Queen." The guard noticed a black sedan approaching from the distance. His heart rate increased until he realized it was just another palace staff member arriving for work. but the incident reminded him that they were exposed here in the open courtyard. "We need to move somewhere private," James said. "But first, tell me about these photographs the blackmailer claims to have." Margaret's face went pale again. "He sent me one as proof. It showed the interior of the Queen's private study, including her personal safe and some documents on her desk. The photograph was taken from an angle that suggested someone had been inside her private quarters." James felt a chill run down his spine. If someone had gained unauthorized access to the Queen's private rooms, it represented a massive security breach. The implications went far beyond simple theft. It suggested a level of infiltration that could threaten the entire royal family. "Do you still have this photograph?" he asked. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I've been carrying it with me, afraid to leave it anywhere in the palace." James unfolded the paper and studied the image carefully. It was indeed a photograph of the Queen's private study, taken from a position that would have required someone to be standing inside the room. The details were clear enough to see specific items on the Queen's desk and the combination dial on her personal safe. "Margaret, this changes everything," James said quietly. "This isn't just blackmail. Someone has been inside the Queen's most secure private areas. We're dealing with a serious security breach that could put her life in danger." Margaret began to cry softly. "I know, James. I've been terrified for weeks, but I didn't know what to do. The caller said he would be watching, and that any unusual security activity would trigger the release of the information." James looked at his watch. It was now past 9 in the morning, which meant the palace would soon be bustling with staff and visitors. They needed to make a decision quickly about how to handle the situation. "Listen to me carefully, Margaret," James said in a calm but firm voice. "We're going to solve this, but we need to be smart about it. First, we're going to secure these diamonds. Then we're going to figure out who this blackmailer is and how he gained access to the Queen's private areas." Margaret wiped her eyes and nodded. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she wasn't facing this crisis alone. "What do you want me to do?" James looked at the diamonds, then at Margaret's frightened face, and made a decision that would either save the Queen from scandal or cost him his career. "You're going to keep that appointment in Hyde Park, but this time you won't be going alone." James Mitchell spent the next 2 hours carefully planning what would either be the most successful operation of his career or his last day as a royal guard. He had moved the diamonds to a secure location within the palace and was now studying maps of Hyde Park with Margaret in a small, windowless office that he knew wasn't monitored by standard security cameras. "Tell me exactly what the blackmailer said about the meeting," James instructed, spreading a detailed map of the park across the desk. Margaret pulled out a small notebook where she had written down every detail of her conversations with the mysterious caller. "He said to come alone to the bench near the Serpentine Lake at exactly noon. I should carry the diamonds in a blue shopping bag and sit on the bench for exactly 10 minutes. If I follow the instructions perfectly, someone will approach and tell me where to find the promised information about getting the diamonds back." James studied the location on the map. The bench was in a relatively open area with good visibility from multiple angles, but it also had enough foot traffic to provide cover for surveillance. It was actually a clever choice for a clandestine meeting. "Has he called you since the first contact?" James asked. 3 times, Margaret replied, each time from a different number, and each time the voice sounded different, like he was using some kind of device to disguise it. The last call was yesterday morning, confirming today's meeting. James made notes as Margaret spoke. The blackmailer was clearly sophisticated and careful, which made him more dangerous but also suggested he might be vulnerable to the right kind of counter-surveillance. "Margaret, I need you to understand something important," James said seriously. "When we go to this meeting, there's a chance that the blackmailer will realize you're not alone. If that happens, the situation could become dangerous very quickly." Margaret nodded, though James could see fear in her eyes. "I understand. But James, what if he really does have compromising information about the Queen? What if this whole thing backfires and makes everything worse?" The guard had been thinking about the same question. "I've been wondering about that too. But here's what doesn't make sense. If this person really had truly damaging information about the Queen, why ask for diamonds instead of money? Diamonds are hard to sell without creating a trail, especially ones that might be recognized." Margaret frowned. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe the real goal isn't the diamonds themselves. Maybe someone wants to create a scandal by making it look like the Queen's diamonds were stolen, or maybe they want to expose security weaknesses in the palace. The possibility sent a chill through both of them. If James was right, then Margaret had been manipulated into participating in something much larger and more dangerous than simple blackmail. "There's something else bothering me," James continued. "How did this person know so much about your access to the Queen's private areas? That suggests either someone inside the palace is involved, or someone has been watching you specifically for a long time." Margaret's face went white. "You think someone has been spying on me?" "It's possible. Think carefully. Have you noticed anything unusual over the past few months? Anyone asking questions about your work, or showing unusual interest in your routines?" Margaret was quiet for several minutes, clearly trying to remember details that might have seemed unimportant at the time. Finally, she looked up with a startled expression. "There was something," she said slowly. "About 2 months ago, a man came to the palace saying he was a journalist writing a story about long-term palace employees. He asked to interview several of us, including me. The interview lasted about an hour, and he asked very detailed questions about our daily responsibilities and access levels." James felt his pulse quicken. "Did you check his credentials?" "The interview was approved by the palace press office. I assumed they had verified everything." Margaret paused, looking increasingly worried. "But now that I think about it, his questions were very specific about security procedures and my access to different areas of the palace." "Do you remember his name?" "David something. David Richardson, I think. He said he was freelancing for a magazine about British institutions." James made a note of the name. "We'll check on that later. Right now we need to focus on the meeting. I'm going to be in the park before you arrive, watching from multiple positions. I'll have backup nearby, but they'll stay hidden unless something goes wrong." Margaret looked at the clock on the wall. It was now 10:30, which meant they had less than 2 hours before the scheduled meeting. "James, what if this person doesn't show up? What if he suspects something and decides to release whatever information he claims to have? Then we deal with that situation when it happens," James replied firmly. "But Margaret, I think there's something you need to know. I've been thinking about this all morning, and I believe the person who contacted you made a mistake." "What kind of mistake?" James pulled out the photograph that Margaret had shown him earlier. "Look at this picture again, but this time focus on the details in the background." Margaret studied the image more carefully. "I don't see anything unusual." "Look at the window." James pointed to the far side of the photograph. "You can see a reflection in the glass, a partial reflection of whoever took this picture." Margaret squinted at the image. "I can barely make it out." "Exactly. But the palace has high-resolution security cameras that might be able to enhance this image enough to identify the photographer. If we can figure out who took this picture, we'll know who's behind the blackmail." The revelation gave Margaret the first hope she had felt in weeks. "So you think we might be able to catch this person?" "I think we're going to try. But first we need to get through the meeting in Hyde Park. Are you ready for this?" Margaret took a deep breath and nodded. "I've been terrified for 3 weeks. At least now I feel like we have a plan." James gathered the maps and notes from the desk. "Remember, when you go to the park, act naturally. If anyone approaches you, don't let them know that you suspect anything unusual. Our goal is to identify the blackmailer without letting them know we're onto them." As they prepared to leave the office, Margaret turned to James with a question that had been bothering her. "James, why are you helping me with this? You could have just reported me to your superiors and let them handle everything officially." James paused at the door. "Because in 12 years of working here, I've learned that sometimes the most important thing isn't following protocol. It's protecting the people we serve. The Queen trusts you, and that means I should trust you too." Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes again, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than fear. "Thank you, James. I promise I'll never do anything this foolish again. Let's just focus on making sure you get the chance to keep that promise," James replied as they headed toward what would either be the resolution of their crisis or the beginning of something much worse. The morning sun had given way to overcast skies as James positioned himself behind a large oak tree with a clear view of the designated bench near Serpentine Lake. It was 11:45, and Hyde Park was filled with the usual mix of tourists, joggers and office workers enjoying their lunch break. The setting looked perfectly normal, but James felt the tension building in his chest. Through his concealed radio earpiece, He received confirmation that 2 backup officers were positioned at strategic points around the area. They appeared to be casual park-goers, one feeding ducks near the water, another reading a newspaper on a distant bench. Margaret would arrive in 10 minutes, and James still hadn't spotted anyone who looked suspicious. Margaret appeared right on schedule, walking slowly along the path that led to the meeting point. She carried a blue shopping bag exactly as instructed, and to anyone watching, she looked like a middle-aged woman out for a peaceful stroll in the park. Only James could see the slight tremor in her hands and the way she kept glancing around nervously. She reached the bench at exactly noon and sat down, placing the shopping bag beside her feet. James watched as she opened a book and pretended to read just as they had planned. The first few minutes passed without incident, and James began to wonder if the blackmailer had somehow detected their surveillance. Then he saw him. A man in a dark coat was approaching from the direction of the lake, walking casually but with obvious purpose. He appeared to be in his 30s, average height, with short brown hair and glasses. Nothing about his appearance was particularly memorable, which James recognized as a deliberate choice for someone involved in criminal activity. The man sat down on the opposite end of Margaret's bench and opened his own book. For several minutes, neither of them acknowledged the other's presence. James tensed, ready to move if the situation turned dangerous, but everything appeared to be proceeding according to plan. Finally, the man spoke quietly to Margaret without looking at her. James couldn't hear the conversation from his position, but he could see Margaret nodding slightly. After about 3 minutes, the man stood up and walked away, leaving something on the bench beside Margaret. Margaret waited another 5 minutes, as instructed, then picked up both her shopping bag and the item the man had left. As she started to walk back toward the park entrance, James saw what the man had given her. It was a small envelope. James followed Margaret at a safe distance, making sure the mysterious man was no longer in the area. When they reached the designated meeting point outside the park, Margaret was waiting for him with a mixture of relief and confusion on her face. "He took the bag," she said quietly. "But James, something wasn't right about the whole thing." "What do you mean?" James asked, scanning the area to make sure they weren't being followed. "The man who approached me, he seemed nervous, almost scared. And when he spoke, his voice sounded young, like he might be just a teenager or someone in their early 20s. It didn't match the voice from the phone calls at all." James felt a new wave of concern. "What exactly did he say to you?" Margaret opened the envelope and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "He said, 'Take this and follow the instructions exactly. If you don't, people will get hurt.' Then he told me to wait 5 minutes before leaving." James read the note over Margaret's shoulder. It contained an address in London and instructions to come alone to that location at 6 o'clock that evening. The handwriting was neat but shaky, as if written by someone under stress. "Margaret, I think that young man was just another victim in this scheme," James said thoughtfully. "Someone is using multiple people to carry out different parts of this operation, probably so that no one person knows the full plan." "But who would do something so complicated?" Margaret asked. Before James could answer, his radio crackled with an urgent message from one of the backup officers. "James, we've got a problem. I followed the suspect who took the bag, and he just handed it off to someone else. It looks like they're running some kind of relay system." James pressed his earpiece to respond. "Can you stay with the new suspect?" "Negative. He got into a car with 2 other people and they're heading toward central London. I got a partial license plate, but they're moving fast." The situation was becoming more complex by the minute. James realized they were dealing with an organized group, rather than a single blackmailer, which explained the sophisticated planning and multiple phone numbers. "Margaret, we need to make a decision," James said urgently. "We can either report this to the full security team right now, or we can try to follow through with the evening meeting and see if we can identify more members of this group." Margaret looked at the address on the paper. "This location, I recognize it. It's near the building where I was interviewed by that journalist 2 months ago. The one I told you about, David Richardson." James felt pieces of the puzzle starting to connect. That can't be a coincidence. Someone has been planning this operation for months, and that fake interview was probably how they gathered information about your access to the Queen's private areas. "So what do we do?" Margaret asked. James looked at his watch. It was now 12:30, which gave them 5.5 hours to prepare for the evening meeting. "We're going to that address tonight, but this time we're doing it with full backup. This has gone beyond simple blackmail. We're dealing with an organized criminal operation that could threaten the security of the entire royal family." Margaret nodded, though James could see she was still frightened. "What about the diamonds? Do you think they'll actually return them?" "I doubt it," James replied honestly. "I think the diamonds were never the real goal. I think someone wanted to create a situation where palace security would be compromised, or where they could gather more information about our procedures." As they walked back toward the palace, James's radio crackled again. This time it was his supervisor, Sergeant Collins, with an urgent message that made James's blood run cold. "Mitchell, report to headquarters immediately. We've just received intelligence that someone has been asking questions about the Queen's security details at several locations around London. We think there may be a plot against her safety." James exchanged a look with Margaret. Their private investigation had just become part of something much larger and more dangerous. "Margaret, listen to me carefully," James said as they reached the palace gates. "I have to report to my superiors immediately, but I want you to stay in your office and don't talk to anyone about what happened today. Don't answer any phone calls and don't leave the palace until I come to get you." "James, you're scaring me," Margaret said softly. "I'm scared too," James admitted, "but we're going to figure this out. Just promise me you'll stay safe until I get back." As Margaret disappeared into the palace, James realized that what had started as a simple case of stolen diamonds had evolved into a potential threat against the Queen's life. The evening meeting would either provide answers or lead them deeper into danger, but either way, James knew there was no turning back now. The Royal Security Headquarters buzzed with unusual activity as James arrived for his emergency briefing. Commander Sarah Blake, head of Palace Security, was surrounded by intelligence officers, computer screens, and photographs spread across multiple tables. James had never seen the command center in such a state of alert. "Mitchell, good timing," Commander Blake called out as she spotted him. "We need to brief you on a developing situation that may be connected to your patrol route this morning." James felt his stomach tighten, but he maintained a professional demeanor. "Yes, ma'am. What can you tell me?" Commander Blake led him to a large monitor displaying what appeared to be surveillance footage from various locations around London. "Over the past week, we've identified at least 6 different individuals asking detailed questions about royal security procedures at shops, restaurants, and hotels that the royal family frequents." The screen showed clear images of people who appeared to be conducting casual conversations with staff members, but James could see that the conversations were anything but casual. Each person was systematically gathering information about timing, routes, and security protocols. "What's particularly concerning," Commander Blake continued, "is that these individuals seem to know exactly who to talk to and what questions to ask. They're targeting people who would have access to sensitive information, but might not recognize the security implications of sharing it." James studied the faces on the screen carefully, looking for anyone who might match the description of the man from Hyde Park, or the mysterious journalist who had interviewed Margaret. "Do we know if these people are working together?" "That's what we're trying to determine," replied Intelligence Officer Martinez, joining the conversation. "But the coordination suggests a single organization with significant resources and planning capabilities." Commander Blake activated another screen showing a timeline of events. The pattern began about 2 months ago, right around the time someone claiming to be a freelance journalist was conducting interviews with palace staff members. James's heart rate increased, but he tried to keep his expression neutral. "Have you been able to verify the identity of this journalist?" "That's one of our biggest concerns," Officer Martinez responded. "David Richardson, the name he gave, doesn't exist in any legitimate journalism database. The press credentials he showed appeared to have been expertly forged." Commander Blake turned to James directly. "Mitchell, I'm telling you this because your patrol route covers areas where some of this suspicious activity has been detected. I need you to be extra vigilant and report anything unusual, no matter how minor it might seem." James nodded, knowing that he was sitting on information that could be crucial to their investigation. But he also realized that revealing Margaret's situation now might compromise their chance to catch the criminals in the act. "Commander, what's our current assessment of the threat level?" James asked. "High," Commander Blake replied without hesitation. "We believe someone is planning either an assassination attempt or a major security breach. The Queen returns from her official duties tomorrow, and we're implementing maximum security protocols." The timing made James realize that the evening meeting Margaret was supposed to attend might be connected to the Queen's return. If criminals were planning something for tomorrow, they would need tonight to make final preparations. "Ma'am, I'd like to volunteer for additional duty shifts," James said carefully. "If there's a credible threat, I want to help protect the royal family." Commander Blake looked pleased by his dedication. "I appreciate that, Mitchell. Actually, we're planning a covert operation tonight to try to identify more members of this suspected criminal network. Would you be interested in participating?" James felt a surge of both excitement and anxiety. "Absolutely, ma'am. What kind of operation?" "We've identified several locations where we believe meetings might take place tonight," Officer Martinez explained, spreading a map across the table. "We'll have teams positioned at each location, waiting to see who shows up." James looked at the map and felt his blood pressure spike. One of the marked locations was exactly the address Margaret had been given for her evening meeting. "This location here," James said, pointing to the address. "What makes you think criminal activity might occur there?" "Intelligence reports suggest it's been used as a meeting point for suspicious individuals over the past month," Commander Blake explained. "We'll have a full surveillance team in place by 5 o'clock. James realized he was facing an impossible situation. If he revealed Margaret's involvement now, she could be arrested as an accomplice. But if he didn't tell his superiors about the planned meeting, he might be interfering with their operation. "Commander, I need to ask you something in confidence," James said, making a decision that could end his career. "If one of our staff members had been approached by these criminals but was cooperating with law enforcement, what would be the protocol?" Commander Blake's expression became very serious. "Mitchell, do you have specific information about this case?" "I might," James replied carefully. "But I need to know that any staff member who was being victimized by these criminals would be protected, not prosecuted." Officer Martinez leaned forward. "James, if you know something, you need to tell us immediately." Lives could be at stake. James took a deep breath and made his decision. "I believe Margaret Whitfield, the Queen Consort's personal secretary, has been targeted by this criminal organization. She's been blackmailed into cooperating with them, and she's supposed to meet someone at that address tonight." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Commander Blake activated her secure phone immediately. "Get me the Director of Security. We have a code red situation." Within minutes, the small briefing room was filled with senior security officials. James found himself at the center of the most important security meeting of his career, explaining everything he knew about Margaret's situation and the events of the morning. "So the diamonds are already in criminal hands?" asked Director Phillips, the head of Royal Security. "Yes, sir," James replied. "But I believe they were never the real target. I think the criminals wanted to compromise Ms. Whitfield, so they could use her access to gather information for a larger operation." Director Phillips studied the photographs and timeline that James had provided. "Your assessment makes sense, Sergeant Mitchell. If they were planning something for tomorrow when the Queen returns, they would need inside information about security procedures and timing." Commander Blake looked at the clock. "It's now 3:30. We have 2.5 hours before the scheduled meeting. I recommend we proceed with the surveillance operation, but now we'll know exactly what to look for." "What about Margaret?" James asked. "She's terrified and she's been manipulated by these people for weeks." "Ms. Whitfield will be protected," Director Phillips assured him. "But we need her to keep that appointment tonight. It may be our only chance to identify the full extent of this criminal network and prevent whatever they're planning for tomorrow." James nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Sir, I request permission to be part of the surveillance team tonight. Margaret trusts me and my presence might help ensure her cooperation." Director Phillips considered the request for a moment. "Granted. But Mitchell, I want you to understand something. If this operation goes wrong, it could result in serious harm to Ms. Whitfield and potentially compromise the Queen's safety. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" James looked around the room at the faces of his superiors, then thought about Margaret's frightened expression and the Queen's trust in both of them. "Yes, sir," he replied firmly. "I'm ready." The late afternoon shadows stretched across London as James prepared for what would become the most dangerous night of his career. The security headquarters had transformed into a command center with multiple screens showing street, cameras and radio communications crackling, With updates from surveillance teams positioned throughout the city, Margaret sat in a secure briefing room, looking pale but determined. Director Phillips had spent an hour explaining the situation to her and reassuring her that she would be protected. Now she understood that her cooperation could prevent a serious attack against the Queen and possibly save lives. "Margaret, you need to act exactly as you would if you were going to this meeting alone," Commander Blake explained for the third time. "These people have been watching you for months, so any change in your behavior could alert them that something is wrong." Margaret nodded slowly. She had been fitted with a tiny communication device that would allow the security team to hear everything that happened during the meeting. A tracking device had been sewn into her coat so they could monitor her location at all times. James checked his equipment one final time. He would be positioned in a building across the street from the meeting location, with a clear view of all entrances and exits. 2 other teams would be hidden nearby, ready to move in if Margaret was threatened. "Remember," Director Phillips said to the assembled team, "our primary goal is to identify as many members of this criminal organization as possible. We believe they are planning something major for tomorrow when the Queen returns to the palace. Tonight might be our only chance to stop them." At 5:30, Margaret left the palace in her personal car. She drove slowly through London traffic, while the security teams followed at a safe distance. James could hear her breathing through the communication device, and he could tell she was trying hard to stay calm. The meeting location was a small office building in a quiet part of London. Most of the businesses had closed for the day, which made the area perfect for a clandestine meeting, but also more dangerous because there were fewer people around if something went wrong. Margaret parked her car exactly where she had been instructed and walked to the building entrance. James watched through high-powered binoculars as she pressed the buzzer for apartment number 12. After a moment, the door opened and she disappeared inside. "Target is inside the building," James reported through his radio. "No other suspicious activity visible from my position." For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then James noticed a white van parked at the far end of the street. 2 men sat in the front seats, and they appeared to be watching the building where Margaret had gone. James focused his binoculars on the van and managed to get a clear look at both men. "Command, I have eyes on a suspicious vehicle," James reported. "White van with 2 occupants maintaining surveillance on the target building." "Copy that," came the response from Director Phillips. "Team 2, can you get a closer look at that vehicle?" Before Team 2 could respond, James saw something that made his heart stop. A third man had appeared from behind the building and was walking directly toward Margaret's car. The man was carrying what looked like a small device, and he was clearly intending to tamper with her vehicle. "Command, we have a problem," James said urgently into his radio. "Unknown subject is approaching the target's vehicle with what appears to be an electronic device. All teams, prepare to move in," Director Phillips ordered immediately. But before anyone could act, James saw Margaret emerging from the building. She was walking quickly and she looked frightened. The man near her car saw her coming and immediately moved away, pretending to be a casual pedestrian. Margaret got into her car and started the engine. James could hear her voice through the communication device as she spoke to herself, trying to stay calm. "It's okay, Margaret, just drive normally and get back to the palace." As Margaret's car pulled away from the curb, the white van started following her. James watched in growing alarm as a second vehicle, a dark sedan, joined the pursuit from a side street. "Command, the target is being followed by at least 2 vehicles, James reported. "This looks like they're planning to intercept her before she reaches the palace. All units converge on Margaret's location immediately," Director Phillips commanded. "This is now a priority 1 emergency." James left his observation post and ran to his own vehicle. As he drove through London traffic trying to catch up with Margaret, he could hear increasing panic in her voice through the communication device. "There are cars following me," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "What should I do? Should I drive to the police station? Margaret, can you hear me?" James spoke into his radio, hoping she could hear him through her earpiece. "Keep driving toward the palace, but take the route we discussed. Don't try to lose them, just maintain steady speed." The next 20 minutes were the longest of James's life. Through radio communications, he could track Margaret's progress as she drove through London, with the criminal vehicles in pursuit. Security teams were racing from multiple directions to intercept the criminals, but London traffic was making it difficult to reach her quickly. Finally, James heard the words he had been hoping for. Target vehicle has reached palace security perimeter, reported one of the teams. Pursuit vehicles are breaking off and leaving the area. Margaret's car pulled through the palace gates with palace security vehicles immediately surrounding her. James arrived moments later to find Margaret sitting in her car shaking but unharmed. The criminals had vanished into London traffic, but at least Margaret was safe. What happened in that building? Commander Blake asked as they helped Margaret out of her car. Margaret took several deep breaths before answering. There were 3 people waiting for me. They weren't interested in returning the diamonds at all. They wanted detailed information about the Queen's schedule for tomorrow. They knew she was returning from her official duties and they wanted to know exact timing and routes. Director Phillips looked grim. Did you give them any information? I told them what we planned, Margaret replied. False information about timing and security procedures, just like you instructed me to do. James felt a wave of relief. The evening had been terrifying, but their plan had worked. Margaret was safe, and they had successfully fed false information to the criminals, which would hopefully disrupt whatever they were planning for the next day. Margaret, you were incredibly brave tonight, James told her as they walked toward the palace entrance. You may have prevented a serious attack against the Queen. Margaret managed a weak smile. I just want this nightmare to be over. It will be, Director Phillips assured her. Thanks to your courage tonight, we now know exactly what these criminals are planning. Tomorrow, when they try to carry out their attack, we'll be ready for them. As they entered the palace, James realized that Margaret's ordeal had revealed a sophisticated plot against the royal family. The stolen diamonds had been just the beginning. Tomorrow would bring the real test of whether their counterplan would succeed in protecting the Queen and bringing the criminals to justice.